My mother said that they didn't know that they were poor. She lived out in Garrettson Beach at the time that I was describing the story that had my uncle getting dressed up as a little girl and then made to sing. I looked through some of my notes that I got from interviews with my mom, and that was actually the barracks at Floyd Bennett Field. Apparently, there was a bar there, and it wasn't that far from where they were living. But I've done that walk. That's a good like mile or two for young kids. Um, and that's now defunct airfield, but Floyd Bennett's actually kind of an amazing space to go to if you happen to be out in Brooklyn. But that would have probably been late 40s, 47, 48. And apparently they had to boil the water because it wasn't really clean, and they had chickens in the backyard to kind of keep themselves going. And my mother was, they, as she said, they didn't know that they were poor, but she had described different things where local stores gave them food. My mother then quit high school at age 16 out of the last place that they were living, which was around 60th Street and 4th Avenue in Brooklyn. When my mother quit, she then went and worked for Ma Bell. I think that she started working in Brooklyn, but I then know that she moved out to Freeport, Long Island, which is part of the thing that had them move out to Wanto, Long Island, which is a town just a little bit further over. Now, working for Ma Bell at the time would have been an extremely stressful type of job. If she was doing what most people did, she would have been working about 56, 60 hours a week. She said that she got promoted to supervisor, so she probably was earning more than the average of about $43.10 per week that most of the operators got. The call volumes would be about 200 per hour. And those connections are, you kind of need to memorize the board. It wasn't labeled. You'd have to know where they went. And despite the fact that most people really preferred to hear a woman on the other line and there were fewer problems with women on the job, apparently there were all these instances early on where male employees would get distracted, not pick up calls, and then start literally wrestling and horsing around, like multiple instances of this for some strange reason at the phone company. But women didn't do that. In the generation before my mother joined became a hello girl, they were called, the operators, the hello girls. Before she became one, the suicide rates were shockingly high. There were many reports on this done in multiple newspapers of the suicide rates of telephone operators. Some aspects of what had gone on in World War II were changing that as women had a little bit more rights, and frankly, there were a lot more of them. At a point in the 1950s, there were suddenly I think about 300,000 operators in America as the phone company expanded. That meant that 1 in every 13 working women worked for the phone company itself. It was an amazing situation for my mother, who now, after having been able to work, had her first real degrees of independence. And this is when she starts dressing well. This is when she starts getting, she bought a new car, or a used car, but a new car. And they move out to this place in the suburbs. They suddenly have, clean water, and they have a yard, and they have all this space. And she's not too far away from one of the hot spots in Long Island at the time, which is Jones Beach, which a developer named Robert Moses, who we'll talk about in a little bit, Robert Moses developed as the Long Island Riviera. It was a beautiful place to go to, and my mother would have been right by the highway with a new car. The phone company, and to be successful there at that time, my mother would have really had to have kind of lost some of her Brooklyn accent. Now, this definitely came up when she was, older and on her own, but for her, that accent was a stigma, and it was a problem at the phone company. She must have been trying to get rid of it early on, to have started at age 16, because it was one of the first screens. They screened for accents, and they all wanted that kind of mid-Atlantic accent, I think they used to call it. It's that weird kind of movie accent of the period. frankly, Scarlett, I don't give a damn. That strange kind of way of talking and that cadence. Well, they wanted the operators to talk like that as well. I don't know where in America that accent actually comes from, because when I hear it, it sounds like it is truly like mid-Atlantic, like in the middle of the ocean, somewhere between England and Maryland. But either way, that was the ideal, the flat American accent. So my mother, coming out of Brooklyn, must have worked against that to have any kind of success at the company. And Long Island was cow country back then, just farms. It was changing fast. But in the year that my mom moved out there was the very same year that the federal government passed some new rule about housing. It was the same year that Levitt started building all of these houses. And Levitt and the Levitt style houses are this kind of famous industrial looking cookie cutter suburb that became the model for the American suburbs. It's been said that Levitt houses were to housing what Ford had done for the car. Levitt houses sold fast. They were cheap. They had appliances included. They were easy commuting distance into the city at the time if you needed to go there for work. These places would be put together quickly, and they would be put together kind of restrictively. They had racial covenants, which, if you're not familiar with a racial covenant is a contract term inside of the sale of a house that actually says you can't sell this to anybody who is not white. Or I think it actually said specifically you can't sell to anyone who's not a member of the Caucasian race. Even more problematic, when my mother's father, his race was listed as Hebrew, and my father's mother's race was listed as Finnish, which I'm not really sure on, and my father's race was listed as Danish on some form. So it seems also like they needed to work that one out a little bit. For people like my mother, this was walking into what the suburbs was. And this was where development was happening. They bought along all the farms into, along the train line and such. And this was where my father grew up. In just his lifetime was just fields and fields and farms in a way that would be almost impossible to recognize now with just the massive expansion of the suburbs, which right now have expanded, another 50 miles east of there. And my father was complaining that it was too crowded in 1955. Nassau County doubled in size in the space of 10 years. Long Island and Nassau County was called Babyland at that time. And there were all of these other aspects that were also coming together that kind of defined what America was going to look like what the suburbs were going to look like. All of these things seem like they were destined to happen. I mean, you could say that because, here I am. But at the same time, it was pretty close. My mother had other quarters. Sorry, Dad. And she actually talked about some of them, but what's amazing is she kept every letter from, if you sent my mom a letter at all, she kept that stuff forever. But what's really strange is there's all these references to all these postcards and letters that she sent, and I haven't been able to find a single one of them. And my father kind of kept a lot of paperwork like that too. My only guess is that my mom probably threw them out. She really kind of liked to edit the way that she appeared to the world. There's Smitty, who's mentioned in a couple of pictures, and he's kind of the boy next door from Brooklyn. And Smitty seems like a nice guy, like he knows the family and all this. And what I see in the letter is my mom has basically just said, no, there is no way that is going to work out. Then there's this other guy that shows up in the pictures that looks very date-like. but he does kind of seem like a jerk. If you're getting a picture taken, could you take just a second, take the cigarette out of your mouth? Why that? But whatever. He seemed kind of a douche, to be honest. But nothing about him, I don't even know the guy's name. The biggest also ran of my mother's entire existence, and this was the one that she talked to, was the butcher boy, who she referred to so often as the butcher boy that it took me a little while to figure out who he is, and I've totally forgotten his actual name. The butcher boy, there were a bunch of letters sent back and forth. There's a couple of pictures in a couple of different locations, so maybe a few different dates and things like this. There's enough evidence out there that the butcher boy was a serious also ran. And that might maybe explain some of my father's kind of frenzied courtship when he is away. He got deployed into multiple locations around the country, Oklahoma, Alaska, Colorado. And then he'd also done a few things where he had been flying supply missions in and around into Korea. And this was what he did during the Korean War, as far as I know. They wound up going on dates with Teddy and Ernie. And funny enough, Ernie was my father's date, Ernie, short for Ernestine. And Teddy was taking my mom out. And I guess Teddy kind of counts as yet another dating prospect, but that didn't really work out. But Teddy and Ernie got along super well, and they were married shortly before my mom and dad in 1956, 57. Their courtship started through a series of letters, which I've kind of read through all of them recently, and I want to talk a little bit about those, even though it does feel kind of creepy to have read through all of them, but it's also interesting. But yeah, it does feel a little creepy. Or going through all this information and going through all of these old letters and the photos and considering their time, you realize how truly uncertain things were for my mom even then, and how much my mother and father were really just young kids trying to figure out the world. And the world was changing for them. It wasn't sure at the time, and that's the thing I just keep on coming back to, is just how unsure and uncertain they were. My father, he always seemed to know what he wanted, and he always seemed to be so sure about everything and so incredibly confident in himself. And one of the more amazing things about reading through all these letters is to see just how much doubt and how much uncertainty there really was between them. And that's the thing that's been kind of incredible to me, is to see these people who were so, I don't know, almost set in a way or sure of what they've done, go through all of those doubts and decisions that they didn't know if they were going to work out. That so many of the things in my life that were facts and already decided were, for them at that time, completely unsure.